that this is what most of them are. Production subsidies are where governments explicitly or implicitly give money to the industry, usually to the energy industry or usually oil and gas companies, in the form of tax allowances or exemptions or various other kinds of benefits, soft loans, guarantees, equity injections, all that kind of thing, in order to boost the profitability of those industries. Those are production subsidies, and if they go to fossil fuel companies, that are also fossil fuel subsidies. But they are different from consumption subsidies. And most subsidies around the world are consumption subsidies. To give you a sense of scale, this is the graph from the IEA and the OECD about the size of fossil fuel subsidies globally around the world, and also the breakdown by what it is that's getting subsidized. And you can see, broadly speaking, that globally subsidies move up and down with the oil price. So when the oil price is high, the gap between international prices and domestic prices is large. You get a lot of subsidies. When that narrows, then subsidies go down a little bit. But look at the size of the scale. The scale is on the left-hand side there, and typically you're averaging around about $600 billion every year. If you look at the figure for 2022, which has just been released, but then they haven't done the graph yet, the figure for 2022 is over $1 trillion, primarily thanks to Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the huge spike in oil and gas, particularly gas prices as a result. So we're talking about something here which is 4 times all aid. You know, all these donors like to puff out their chests and say how much money that they're distributing in aid to various countries around the world. Energy subsidies are at least 4 times the entire sum of all aid that's given around the world. So they're a relatively big deal. Okay, so that's what subsidies are. Why are they troublesome? Well, of course, the number one reason that everyone goes to is climate change. This is the classic graph, is how the climate is warming up as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. Vast majority of these are coming from human activities, in particular from the burning of fossil fuels. To give you an indication of how important this is, the IMF have estimated that if one was to price fossil fuels at their true cost, that is to say, including their environmental cost, their environmental externality, then CO2 emissions would be 28% lower. So in other words, there's a huge potential gain on the fight against climate change if we were to address fossil fuel subsidies properly. But I think it's often less appreciated that there are many other impacts of fossil fuel subsidies. If you make fossil fuels cheap, then people obviously consume more of them. And that means that you not only get more greenhouse gas emissions, but you get an awful lot of more other unpleasant emissions too. Globally, there were 3.4 million deaths associated with outdoor air pollution. The vast majority of those deaths, whether it's India, China, or Indonesia, or anywhere else, are caused by particulate pollution, most often coming from coal-fired power stations or from motor vehicle emissions. In other words, from fossil fuel burning. And fossil fuel burning, you get more of it if it's cheaper. So outdoor air pollution is one of the major reasons why fossil fuel subsidies are problematic. And there are other reasons. This is a graph taken from Nigeria. On the left-hand side, what you can see is the Nigerian budget for education, health, and social protection for 2021 and 2022. And the gray bar is what they spent making petrol cheap. Nigerians hold the price of petrol well below the international market, and they subsidize this using their oil revenues. Some months this means that Nigeria, the largest oil exporter in the world, makes no money from oil, because they're spending all of that oil revenue subsidizing petrol to a tune which is at least 3 times their entire health budget. Is this a sensible use of resources? On the right-hand side, you'll see another graph, this one also from Nigeria, but I could put this from any country in the world pretty much. The study has been done many times in different countries, which just shows the incidence, the distribution of the benefits, if you like, from fuel subsidies. And unsurprisingly, fuel subsidy benefits go overwhelmingly to the better off. Why? Well, those are the people who've actually got cars or motorbikes. And so those are the ones who are actually purchasing fossil fuels. On average, the top income quintile gets around about 6 times more from subsidies from the bottom quintile. For petrol, that ratio is around about 20 to 1. Okay, so I've given you a sense of what subsidies are and also why they're problematic. If as pretty much everyone agrees that they're a bad thing. You know, the UN Secretary General frequently comes up and says, this is terrible, we've got to get rid of these things. Then why do they persist? Why is fossil fuel subsidy so hard? And I think there's 5 reasons, and I'm going to run through those 5 reasons. And I think together they paint a picture as to why it's been so difficult internationally to get rid of fossil fuels. The first reason is because fossil fuel subsidy reform hurts people. Almost all fossil fuel subsidies are resulting from keeping a domestic price, lower than an international price. If you do a reform, it almost invariably entails a price rise, sometimes quite a significant price rise. Price rises are not popular. And so it's perfectly understandable that policymakers who are genuinely concerned about the well-being of their citizens and their voters might say, well, I really don't want to shock everybody with an unpleasant price rise. Not only that, I just showed you a graph showing that the vast majority of the benefits of fossil fuel subsidies go to the better off. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that when you remove fossil fuel subsidies, the poor are not hurt. The little pie charts you can see here is a nice study done by David Cody and his colleagues a few years back, which looked at both the direct and indirect impact associated with fossil fuel subsidy reform. And because fuel prices feed into the prices of transportation, particularly diesel subsidies feed into the cost of transportation, and the single most transported thing in most countries is food, you tend to get a food price spike associated with fossil fuel subsidy reform. And the poor consume food is a bigger share of their expenditure than anybody else. So fossil fuel subsidy reform, unfortunately, can cause real harm, even to those in the bottom quintiles. Secondly, those of you who are political scientists will remember this wonderful picture of the Leviathan from Thomas Hobbes' famous book, which is, of course, talking about what the social contract is between the ruler and the citizens, and could have used any of the multiple writings of social contract over the centuries instead of this one, but I just have to like the picture. But the reason I talk about the social contract is that fossil fuel subsidies are very much part and parcel of a social contract between politicians and citizens. Basically, the deal is, particularly in oil exploiting countries, we have this stuff. It's difficult, complex, or costly to actually deliver effective services like health and education. So we'll work on those. But in the meantime, we're going to give you cheap fuel. Cheap fuel is part and parcel of the bargain that leaders have with their citizens that say, don't you worry, this is us giving you back something because of the natural resource endowment that we have. Now, the problem is if politicians have for years or indeed decades told everybody, all of their voters, that this is part and parcel of the social contract, and they then do fossil fuel subsidy reform, everybody not unreasonably thinks, hey, you're breaking the social contract that you've been banging on about for so long. And this naturally makes politicians rather reluctant to make a change. The third reason, and perhaps the most important reason for most political leaders, is that price increases associated with fossil fuel subsidy reform tend to mobilize the opposition. This is just a gift to the opposition, and therefore mobilize opposition to you and your government. Opposition groups always are looking for opportunities to attack the government, to try and bring the government down so that they can replace them. This is true everywhere in all topics around the world. And if you happen to implement a fossil fuel subsidy reform that means the price jumps up by 50% or something of that kind, that's just a great opportunity to mobilize everybody, get everybody out in the street and protesting and saying what a terrible, wicked and incompetent government you are. And let's bundle that together with 100 other issues that people are unhappy with, and so forth. And of course, these things can escalate, as we have seen repeatedly. I wrote a paper with some co-authors last year about the association between fossil fuel subsidies and fuel rights. And there's very clear statistical association across the world. We looked at 155 countries over a long period of time, and a very clear association between high fossil fuel subsidies and fuel rights. That is to say, protests which are really about rising prices of fuel. And the reason is obvious, which is when you have fossil fuel subsidies and you've suppressed prices for so long, then fiscally, when eventually you do have to make a change, you end up making a big change. And that big change then often brings people to the streets. And then if that's suppressed by the government, you can end up with trouble. The picture is of a young Mozambican boy in 2010 during the major riots that occurred there when they tried to do a fossil fuel subsidy reform. A fourth, perhaps more insidious reason why fossil fuel subsidy reform is hard is because it's opposed by people who benefit from fossil fuel subsidies. In every country that has fossil fuel subsidies, there is a small group, sometimes not so small, but often quite small, who benefit explicitly from the existing system and who often are well connected. Think, for example, of farmers who get near free electricity for irrigation purposes in India. These farmers are a really important voting bloc. Even Modi, who is relatively powerful in the Indian context, was not able to reform electricity subsidies for farmers. They all get out onto the streets, they protest, and suddenly he backs down. Think of fuel importers who've got with monopoly rights or groups who can round trip. This happened frequently in Nigeria during the previous subsidy regime, and they've changed the way in which they do it now. But under the previous subsidy regime, the people who were importing fuel were given the payment of the subsidy. So what happened was you bring a tanker in, you would offload half of the fuel, claim all of the subsidy. Thank you very much. Then you would take the tanker out again, go around the block a bit, bring the tanker back in again, offload the other half of the fuel, claim all of the subsidy a second time. This is a good way of making yourself extremely rich. And it's not uncommon. And then thirdly, if you look at subsidies where they're very large countries where they're very large fuel subsidies, and if you look at their borders, you will always see large quantities of smuggling going on. So again, in the Nigerian context, theoretically, Nigeria consumes 71 million liters of fuel every day. Does it really? It's only really feasible for Nigeria to consume about 50 to 60 million liters every day. Around about 10 million liters every day are pouring over the borders to Benin and Cameroon and various other things. And that, of course, is aided and abetted by police and by customs officials who are getting themselves very rich in the process. And unfortunately, many of those who benefit from subsidy regimes are wealthy, they're very well politically connected, they fund campaigns for various politicians, and so they're in a position to say, oh, no, we can't possibly do a fossil fuel subsidy reform. Think of the impact upon the poor, whereas what they're really thinking about is the impact on their pocket. And then the final reason why subsidy reform, I think, is very difficult is because, in principle, it would be possible to replace subsidies with something better, but people don't trust that the government will. Imagine the situation. Politicians are not great in whatever country you might happen to be from. They haven't really delivered you effective infrastructure or good health care or good education or good anything else for that matter. And suddenly they say, hey, you know what? We're going to inflict some pain upon you by raising prices and getting rid of these subsidies. But don't worry, because we're going to give you cash transfers on that cash transfer scheme that we haven't set up properly. Or we're going to give you good public transport, which we've never delivered before. Or we're going to give you good health and education, which we haven't had a good track record for. If people don't believe that you're going to do it, they'd rather have the subsidy in their hand rather than the promise of something better. I was hunting for an image for lack of trustworthiness, and this is the best one I could find from a UK context. But I'm sure every country will have their own image for that. So collectively, these 5 problems mean that fossil fuel subsidies are stuck. We've ended up with far larger fossil fuel subsidies in 2022, 2023 than we had 12, 13 years ago when the G20 at least promised that they were going to eliminate them. What has the country experience been with fossil fuel subsidy reform? Well, let's talk about the country closest to our heart, which is Indonesia. And we all know the story of Indonesia. We don't need to go into any great detail. But in 2014, Jokowi did something quite remarkable, which was during his campaign, he talked about subsidies. Generally speaking, you don't talk about subsidies in your election campaign for a pretty obvious reason that it's kind of embarrassing and they're hard to get rid of. But Jokowi talked about it incessantly. And as we all know, when he did so, he whipped out, usually wearing his check shirt, he whipped out his Kartu Sehat and Kartu Pintar and told everybody that they were going to get these nice cards. And this was very popular. He won pretty convincingly in 2014. And come 2015, or actually in November 2014, he abolished petrol subsidies, at least for Java, Bali, Madura, which is the main part of it. He transferred effectively $16 billion from Indonesia's budget to Indonesia's budget, but to use it better, mostly for infrastructure and social programs. I remember at the time I was the lead economist for the AusAid program, and rather uncomfortably pointed out to them that Jokowi had just paid himself, or Indonesia had just paid itself 30 years worth of Australian aid. So this is how much subsidies really mattered. This was a huge sum of money. He also, and I think this is absolutely critical, introduced a formula for fuel price adjustment. And this was great until, unfortunately, international prices started rising. In 2016, when international prices did started rising, it became rather politically inconvenient to raise prices in line with the formula. So the formula was abandoned. The single price policy was introduced, which is very expensive, of course, particularly for getting fuel out to eastern areas of the country. And by 2018, Pertamina was losing about $4 billion a year. And in 2019, of course, we had another election campaign. Jokowi wanted to win this election campaign, hadn't solved the subsidy problem, didn't really talk about it at all, even when asked. So in a sense, Indonesia is a wonderful example of what to do right, but also just how hard subsidy reform is. He communicated really well. He was a leader. He cared about the issue. He timed it really well. He compensated people using the existing cash transfer mechanisms, and he reinvested the money in health, education, and infrastructure. All the classic things that you're supposed to do. And yet, that political window of being able to act was very short. He didn't shift the system in a sustainable way. It basically broke down when the formula was abandoned. And then he just hid the whole thing in Pertamina. In other words, fossil fuel subsidy reform is a long game. And of course, as we go into another election campaign in Indonesia, we're back up to a situation where 15 to 20% of the budget is being spent subsidizing energy. Fortunately, Indonesia has made a great deal of money from very high coal prices and very high other natural resource prices, so it probably can afford it. But the problem has still very much not been solved. I've got another example here from Lebanon, but I think I'm running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to leave that one by. Lebanon is a good example of how not to do a fossil fuel subsidy reform, and I can come back to that in questions if anybody is interested. But Lebanon, as everybody knows, has got an extremely troubled economy, which tried to do and successfully did a fossil fuel subsidy reform, but at great pain to its population. Let me talk about how we changed the approach to fossil fuel subsidy reform. At the moment, we've got an approach which is very technical. It says, well, what you really need to do is to analyze this. And once you've analyzed it, got some clever economists to work out that fossil fuel subsidy reforms are a bad idea, then let's put in place a World Bank recommended subsidy reform program, which consists of good communication and cash transfers and so on and so forth. None of this is bad advice. All makes sense. But at its core, fossil fuel subsidy reform is a political problem, not a technical one. The bottom line is that fossil fuel subsidy reform in and of itself is never going to be a political objective. I may happen to think that fossil fuel subsidy reform is a very sexy topic and therefore everybody should be interested in it, but the vast majority of people are not. What matters to citizens is that they are protected when they face a crisis. What matters to voters are peace, protection, whether it's from COVID or from high inflation, and some sense that things are going to get better. Peace, protection, and prosperity are what politicians therefore care about. Governments are right to care about these things. They don't do fossil fuel subsidies and care about fossil fuel subsidies in and of themselves. They use fossil fuel subsidies as a tool, sometimes effectively or ineffectively, to try and deliver peace, protection, and prosperity. And for that reason, fossil fuel subsidy reform, if it's going to be successful, has to be tied to something which is politically salient, has to be tied to something that people care about, whether it's energy security, climate protection, better air quality, the hope of something new. What tends to happen is this. Unsuccessful reformers, and my word, are there lots of unsuccessful fossil fuel subsidy reformers around the world. Now that I've studied this issue in multiple countries, you can see how badly wrong it repeatedly goes. And what do? They say, we know this is a problem, but it's a very tricky one, so we'll avoid it for as long as possible. Then when you can't avoid it anymore because you're in the middle of a fiscal crisis, then you make changes in the middle of that crisis. You fail to plan for the compensation. Fortunately, Indonesia plans very well for compensation, but many other countries don't. You fail to construct any kind of sort of credible narrative. So it's very obvious that you're doing this because your back is against the wall. You don't communicate about it at all. The Nigerian 2012 reforms, for example, happened on the 1st of January. Happy New Year, bang, 100% price increase, no prior warning. And then when everybody takes to the streets to complain about the impact upon them, then you bring out the army and you shoot people. And this has happened again and again and again. And unfortunately, the record of outsiders isn't great either. What do outsiders, mostly donors and various other organizations, do? They provide lots of technical analysis saying, hey, this is a big problem. They support government teams. They work with official post holders. They push for reforms in times of crisis because they see it as an opportunity. And then equally, they sometimes pursue contradictory commercial policies. So, for example, you really must get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. But by the way, here's a nice refinery we'd like to sell you. They don't encourage anybody to involve citizens in the conversation. And then they go to G20 meetings and say, hey, we really ought to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies after things have got no better. So we haven't got a great track record on supporting this. What would action look like if we treated fossil fuel subsidy reform as the political problem that it is? Well, we can learn lessons from what successful reformers do. First of all, understand the politics. Construct a narrative that actually is appealing. Build coalitions of support so you don't instantly get attacked. We saw a perfect instance of that recently in Indonesia, where Indonesia for a long time has been working on trying to reform LPG subsidy reforms. And it recently announced that it was going to have a major program of rolling out induction stoves, a very sensible idea. For one of the candidates in the forthcoming elections to say, what, you mean you're going to rip away everybody's LPG from them? That's the wicked and terrible thing to do. And suddenly the government had to back down. So you've got to have a coalition which has got to support this in order for these things to survive. Otherwise, they won't.
Sorry, Neil, can I interrupt you there?
Please.
Yeah, because while you are on this slide, there is a clarification question from May. Who are exactly these outsiders?
Good question, yes. So I use the term outsiders rather loosely. In many, many countries, there are donors or other countries who are interested in influencing policy. So these are what I mean by outsiders, whether they're embassies or whether they are the World Bank or the IMF or entities like that. And in some cases, outsiders can include international NGOs or that kind of thing. So that's what I mean by outsiders. So there's a whole pile of lessons there from what successful reformers do. And what these outsiders, what donors might be able to do, well, first of all, would be to a lot more politically savvy. Analyze the politics. Good at analyzing the technical side of things. Outsiders also include academics, perhaps even Australian academics. Think about how one builds demand for reform, not just supply. How you pull together groups of people who will be interested in reform, who've got an interest in reform. Donors could help with costs of compensation so that the shock is not so large. The private sector are often very interested in subsidy reform. They want it to happen. So try and harness the engagement of the private sector. And critically, and I think this is really important, encourage citizen involvement. At the moment, citizens barely get a voice other than getting out in the streets whenever prices go up. They barely get a voice in discussions about fossil fuel subsidy reform, and that needs to change. So I thought I'd finish with a controversial slide about the role for research, since ANU is a world-leading research institution and FKP is full of researchers. What's the role for research? And the first lesson is a rather sad one, which is the answer is pretty limited. Evidence is not what counts in this debate. This is a fundamentally political challenge. So whilst evidence is great, there's been huge amounts of evidence, huge number of studies done on this, and no one's paying the slightest bit of attention. So it's not evidence that cracks this problem. However, what researchers can do, and I think should do, is continue to analyze the distortionary impact and harms caused by fossil fuel subsidies. Great paper, I know Paul Burke was one of the authors of something looking at the congestion caused in Jakarta as a result of fossil fuel subsidies. Those sort of studies are great, and not just the impact of fossil fuel subsidies on climate change or budgets, but also air pollution and congestion and all of these other things that people rightly care about. So let's get good analysis of that, because eventually that stuff does percolate into the policy world. But above all, perhaps, study the political economy constraints to reform. Acho, you and I first got together doing a political economy study. And I think for both of us as economists, it was our first time really scratching beneath the surface of political economy. And it was a fascinating experience. We need far more studies that look at who captures the rents along the fuel supply chain and how are they catching those rents? How do these rents influence the political decision-making process? These are things which can be studied. And when these details are laid bare, then the possibility of change is there. And then also, why don't we examine how successful transitions took place in other countries? Many countries don't have major problems with fossil fuel subsidies. Why? How did they transition from situations where they did subsidize fossil fuels to a situation where they didn't? And what lessons can we usefully learn? So thank you very much. And please buy the book, or at least download it.
Thank you so much, Neil. Very succinct and very well timed. And we have around 30 minutes for question and answer. So let's see if we have questions. Anybody wants to ask question, you can write your question or just raise your virtual hands. No question yet.
All perfectly clear.
Oh, Alex has a question. Alex Gotts.
Hello, I'll just unmute myself. Thanks for that fascinating talk, Neil. It was really interesting. You mentioned a bit about some of the groups that were benefiting from these subsidies, and I just can't remember if you specifically mentioned large fossil fuel companies. I'm sure that they have some influence on Australian policy. Did you find that they were significant in your research?
So obviously one of the big beneficiaries of certain types of subsidies are large fossil fuel subsidies. As I said at the beginning of the talk, the vast bulk of fossil fuel subsidies around the world are consumption subsidies, not production subsidies. But in richer countries, you tend to have fossil fuel subsidies as being far more oriented toward production subsidies. So, for example, prior to the most recent year and a half or so, when all European countries, including the UK, implemented huge subsidies in order to try and protect people from the massive spike in gas prices. But prior to that, the UK government said, oh, we have no fossil fuel subsidies. What they meant by that was, we don't distort domestic prices in a way that keeps them below international prices. In other words, no consumption subsidies, although they actually do have consumption subsidies as well, because they subsidize the tax rate. They don't count that. But they do have, the UK has, Australia has, the US has, most relatively wealthy countries have significant production subsidies. And these take the form of tax credits or of various mechanisms of reducing the tax burden associated with those companies. So, for example, you can have things where you are allowed to depreciate the entire capital cost associated with new fossil fuel investments up front, rather than spread it out along the normal depreciation schedule. This is a huge benefit if you're doing a major capital investment. It's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, and it really makes a big difference to the bottom line of oil and gas companies. But it's technical and it's hidden there in the tax code. So nobody really cares about it, knows about it. And of course, it doesn't affect prices for consumers, at least not in the immediate way. So therefore, nobody really cares about it. So it's a very clever way for politicians to effectively funnel resources towards a favored sector, a sector that may also be funding their election campaign. So there's a brilliant paper that maps this out for the United States, which is the country with the best data on this, which shows that in some cases around about half of all of the oil and gas investments would no longer be viable if it wasn't for these tax breaks that the oil and gas companies get. So it's a big deal, particularly not just in rich countries, but particularly in wealthier countries.
Thanks, Neil. I see two hands now, one of Budi Resosudarmo and another one of Patrick Anderson. Let's start with Mas Budi. Go ahead, Mas Budi.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. So I have two questions. The first one is, what do you think about this situation? The typical issue or comment that I receive when I interview people on the street, like the street vendor and so on, related to the subsidy, is that they're actually benefiting. So although we explain it is not efficient, the benefit is not, the bigger benefit is for other group of people, which is the race and so on, but they just don't care. What I think is that, well, at least we get benefit. And then when we suggested, how about if we change into a direct subsidy, direct transfer, cash transfer, and they don't like it. One of the issue with direct transfer is the accuracy of the transfer has been low, and always create a problem as well. And so that is a typical issue during the interview, and I would just want to know your comment on that situation. The second issue that I would like to ask is that despite that many government is still putting fuel subsidy, but carbon market and carbon tax seem to be going to happen. And so what do you think will happen if this subsidy is still there, but carbon trade and carbon market is actually happening? Will it actually be good or even make the problem difficult? So your comment I'm looking forward to hear it. Thank you.
That's pretty good to hear you again, and great questions. So first of all, with regard to the ordinary person you chat to on the street saying, hey, but this thing is a benefit, you're absolutely right. There have been perception surveys done in many countries around the world, including in Indonesia. We did one in 2013, 2014. But I've also done them in Nigeria, amongst other places, and there's several of them. And they all show the same thing, which is 70 to 80% of the population say, we like subsidies, please don't get rid of them. But this is one of the reasons why they're hard to get rid of, is because politicians know that people like subsidies, and that's why they don't want to get rid of them. They're popular. One of the reasons why people don't want them to get rid of them relates to the trust issue before. Some people, if you raise this with them, they'll say, oh, well, okay, I don't want the price to go up, so I want the subsidy to be kept. But I also know that these subsidies have been stolen by all sorts of people, and it makes me very angry. And in principle, it would be better if they gave me free healthcare. But I don't trust them. I don't believe they're really going to do so. So I'd rather keep the low price. Thank you very much. Why should I take the hit associated with their incompetence? So it's a very common view, and it's one of the key reasons, I think, why it's very difficult. You mentioned the point of the accuracy of transfer. I think cash transfers are very important because they actually do protect the poor to some extent. And there's been some studies done which show that in the vast majority of cases where cash transfers are provided, you have some chance of the reform succeeding. If you don't have some kind of transfer mechanism in place when you do a subsidy reform, then it's very rare that the reform is successful. So cash transfers help. But the key lesson I take away from the 2014 reforms in Indonesia, and this is true for many other countries, is it's got to be more than cash. No politician can really go to an electorate and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to hurt you, but it's all right because I'm going to give you a bit of cash. That is just not a sellable political message. You have to have a kartu sehat and a kartu pintar. You have to have a vision. You have to have something that you're selling, which is politically attractive. And cash just doesn't do it. Yes, it's important, compensation reasons and to try and protect the poor, but it's got to be more than that. Your second question is a really nice one about carbon markets and carbon taxes. And I've been chatting a lot with people in Indonesia on this one because, of course, there's the intention right now to introduce a carbon tax. I mean, it's very small, but and also to have the emissions trading scheme. And of course, this is a facade. The reality, Budi, as you well know, is that having a situation where you're taxing things while simultaneously subsidizing the same things means you're just going around in circles. Let's give a concrete example. The carbon tax or the emissions trading requirement, which is going to be imposed upon coal-fired power stations in Indonesia, will have to be paid by those power stations. And they've shrugged their shoulders and said, yeah, sure, no problem, we'll pay that. So they will pay that to the government. And then they will take out their power purchase agreement, which includes a change of law clause. And that change of law clause says any increase and any change of law, which means we have to pay more, you will have to reimburse through the price. So PLN will then have to pay them more for the electricity by exactly the same amount as the additional money that they're paying in the carbon tax. PLN will then go to the Ministry of Finance and say, hey, we need a bigger subsidy, please, because of the extra money we're having to pay on the carbon tax. So this money has quite literally gone around in a loop and changed incentives not one jot. So we have to tackle this problem of subsidies in the system before a carbon tax is going to be effective. At the moment, it's just, for show, because there's jet P20 billion around and you have to put in place a nice ETS. But we've got to make it meaningful. Maybe I'm being harsh and somebody will tell me I'm wrong, but that's my understanding of it at the moment.
Thanks, Neil. Next is Patrick.
Thanks, and thanks, Neil. Excellent presentation. My question concerns subsidies in the oil palm and pulpwood sectors.
Oh, you're on mute, Patrick.
You're muted. Yeah.
Thanks. The government has recently, in Indonesia, has recently said that it wants palm oil to provide 100%. That's the goal of biodiesel, by biosolar. And we'll be working with industry to increase it from, I think, current is 30%. And then in the pulpwood sector, the government has said that it wants to make 10% of the fuel used in our coal-fired power stations to come from biomass, from growing wood chips. Now, both these plans will lead to a doubling in the area of oil palm and a doubling of the area of pulp and paper plantations. And because these will be national priorities, then under the omnibus laws, then the usual environmental and social regulations don't apply. So this sounds to me like a disaster on many fronts and unlikely to do much for climate, but it will involve subsidies. But I just wondered if you have opinions on this and how it might be most successfully challenged, or the issues raised in a way that could make the government rethink those plans. Thank you.
Yeah, Patrick, it's a really good question, and I haven't got a good answer for you because I share your view that this is potentially disastrous. And a lot of it is actually driven by a desire to say, okay, we're going green. So let's have biodiesel. We had started off with, 10%, 20% biodiesel. Now we want 30% biodiesel. Or let's try and make it all biodiesel. The more biodiesel you produce, the more oil palm you have to plant, the more forest you chop. So it's not necessarily a green option at all. And I was horrified when I saw the ARUPTL, the PLN's plan, where they said, well, don't worry about our coal-fired power stations, because just before the deadline where we have to reduce our emissions, we're going to switch them all over to burning biomass. And you're thinking, what biomass? You're burning wood chip. What wood chip? Where are these wood chips coming from? So again, I think it's really important to work our way back the chain and actually figure out what the true environmental impact of these things is. On the oil palm side of things, this is a perfect example of what many countries do, where there's an implicit subsidy there, which manages to get away with not being called a subsidy. So in the state crops mechanism, there's a special fund. And that special fund allows biodiesel to be produced cheap, because the money from the export tax for oil palm goes into the special fund rather than the Ministry of Finance, and then gets recycled back to the palm oil refiners, who coincidentally happen to be the same people who own the palm oil plantations, in order to subsidize the production of biodiesel, which would otherwise be more expensive than importing the fossil version from Singapore. So this is a hidden subsidy. And the government, of course, is in the process of trying to construct exactly the same mechanism for coal in order to get around from its current explicit subsidy through the domestic market obligation, where coal companies have to sell coal for $70 a ton when the world market price is over $200 a ton to PLN. So these are subsidies, and they're very large and important subsidies, but they're disguised subsidies. And I think this is where forensic analysis, which exposes a lot of this and then creates a debate about it, is really valuable. Because we just assume these days that because something's green and we've got a climate crisis, that we should just plow ahead, and it's not necessarily a good idea.
Great. Before I read some written questions, let's take another live one, and that is from Hal Hill. Hal?
Neil, how are you? It's great to see you, at least on the screen.
Great to see you too, Hal.
Yeah, and thanks
Switch on
for
your
an
camera
excellent...
so I can see you.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to work, but thanks for an excellent presentation. I last saw you when we were working together in Kyrgyzstan several years ago, and that was fun too. So, Neil, question, this is coming from someone who lives in a country which has been captured by the coal industry lobby very effectively for quite a long time. I think it's the case, isn't it? But it's a question as well. Most of the developing countries which subsidize fossil fuels are net fossil fuel exporters. But it may not be all countries. For example, neighbouring Philippines, which has trouble doing lots of difficult reform, I'm pretty sure it doesn't subsidise fossil fuels at all. So, but I don't know what the global picture is, but it does suggest at least that there's quite a lot of the story is going to be the capture by the producers. Now, of course, the producers are many forms, some foreign, some domestic, some state-owned. So I'm just wondering, you did mention, but I'm wondering whether that's a really central part of your story. Yeah. And if I could just add on another little question, I'm still puzzled by why doesn't Jokowi 2014 live on? He's constantly said, I'm an infrastructure president, and there's no doubt he believes in that, and he's got a national capital to fund as well. And so you'd sort of think, wouldn't you, that second term, especially when he's not going to run again, this would be the opportunity to really push quite hard again and become Jokowi version in 2014. But in fact, as we know, last year, admittedly, COVID made things complicated, but last year, the subsidies roared back to 3% of GDP. So maybe that's a question for a political scientist as much as it is for you, but I'm just posing it. But as I say, thanks again for a really interesting presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Hal, and good questions. I mean, on this issue of net exporters, you're absolutely right that there's a very strong association with countries being net exporters and having large fossil fuel subsidies. But it's not true that net importers don't have fossil fuel subsidies. In fact, some net importers have very large fossil fuel subsidies relative to the size of their economy, and that's one of the reasons why it's so crippling. Also, there's a difference between being a net exporter of oil and being a net importer of fuel. Nigeria is the example I gave before, which exports lots and lots and lots of oil, is the largest oil exporter in Africa, and yet imports all of its fuel. So there's a gap there. Zambia, for example, had, until the new president arrived and started the reform process, very large fossil fuel subsidies, and it imports all of its fuel. So it's not just that story. One important little tweak on that, and this is the argument that Saudi Arabia always makes, which is if we are able to extract this stuff really, really, really cheap, then why can't we sell it to our domestic population really cheap as well? And that might be a big gap between that and the international price, but we're not losing money because we're just selling it at cost. To be honest, that's fine. I have no particular problem with that. I mean, it's dumb policy because there's an opportunity cost, but it's not actually losing Saudi Arabia any money. And there are countries that do that. However, that isn't the case for the vast majority. Most of them are actually making a real loss. Indonesia is making a real loss from the way in which it's pricing both LPG premium and of course the cost of coal and electricity. So it's making real losses on that account. Your second question about why you don't get where's Jokowi 2.0 or Jokowi 2014? I think the problem is you only get one shot. Mm-hmm. Usually your shot at this is when you're a new president and you're coming in. You will recall, Hal, since you've advised pretty much every president that's come in at some point, that somebody tried to persuade SBY before they left office that it would be a great idea to do a major fossil fuel subsidy reform. And you know perfectly well what SBY's answer to that was. So trying to persuade the outgoing president that, a really nice legacy to leave is everybody hating them for a large price rise is generally not a successful political strategy.
Yeah. So thanks, Neil. Keep up the good work.
Thanks.
Thanks, Hal. Thanks, Neil. So let's move to written questions. There's a very interesting question from Nugrahani Kusumaningsi. She asked, how can donors create demand for subsidy reform rather than just supply of it?
That is a really important question, Nugraini, and I think this is the blind spot, in my view, of many of the outsiders, many of the donors in the sector. They say, hey, we can provide technical assistance, and they provide technical assistance in spades to the Ministry of Finance. Not that Indonesia's Ministry of Finance needs much technical assistance, but maybe Hal will disagree. But they very rarely work with the groups in society in order to bring them together to have sensible debates and discussions as to how one would tackle this problem in the context of Indonesia or in the context of whatever country you happen to be in. And yet there's no reason why donors can't do that. If you think of the old DFID, before it merged with FCDO, it frequently worked with civil society groups, with universities, with campaigning groups of one kind or another, with the private sector. There's no reason why one can't facilitate a debate. It doesn't have to be partisan. It can't be political with a big P, but there's no reason why you can't get everybody to understand the issue. So I had the privilege of being the director of a project on fossil fuel subsidy reform and oil sector transparency in Nigeria for a couple of years. And one of the best things we did as part of that project was to fund the Independent Journalists Association, or Investigative Journalists Association, I should say. And all we did there was saying, listen, let's understand the subject. When you're writing about this, it's got to make sense. Previously, we had articles which were written about this, which were just pure gibberish. They didn't explain anything to anyone because the journalists themselves didn't really understand how the sector worked. So by explaining how the sector works and what the issues are and this kind of things that need to be investigated and why it's problematic and so forth, you hugely improved the quality of journalism on the topic. And as a result, you've got an explosion of very good articles which were contesting these things. And suddenly, politicians had to be a little bit more accountable for the decisions they were taking. So that's the way in which one can provide support to organizations which are demanding reform rather than always supplying support for organizations who are actually doing or supplying the reform.
Thanks. Now I'll combine two questions because I think they're quite similar. That's from Tio Ardiono and Andriansa. So let me read it. The politics of energy should address how to help the poor and reducing the subsidy for the rich. Is there any example in any countries in how to deliver a more targeted subsidy itself beyond providing other social services or social compensation? And Adriansa said he didn't hear in your presentation and find targeted fuel subsidies in your book. Are you suggesting abolishing fuel subsidies entirely? How about targeted fuel subsidies? Do you think it is possible to make fuel subsidies more targeted, and how?
So I think this whole issue of targeting subsidies is an important one. Subsidies aren't bad. In general, they're not bad, whether it's fossil fuel subsidies or any kind of subsidies. Subsidies are a tool of government policy. And when applied appropriately, they can be very helpful. You will have noticed that after Mr. Putin invaded Ukraine and gas prices went through the roof, every single European government and many governments around the world, including the Indonesian government, have applied huge subsidies in order to try and protect people from the enormous shock to their energy bills. In that case, it's perfectly understandable. You know, certainly in Europe here, we didn't want people freezing during the middle of the winter, and so government stepped in and bore the cost. So sometimes subsidies have a purpose, either a distributional purpose, or sometimes they're correcting an externality or promoting a positive externality. So subsidies are not inherently bad. The challenge about targeting fossil fuel subsidies is that it depends what you mean. If you mean targeting compensation, that's one thing, and we all know about both the benefits of doing that, but also the challenges of doing that. Targeting fossil fuel subsidies means you've got to have some way of rationing quantities. And this has been tried again and again. In Indonesia, they tried an RFID card, which didn't work very well. In the Lebanon example, sorry, not in Lebanon, in Sri Lanka, there's a very interesting instance of this. Sri Lanka's also had an economy that's recently collapsed and is in the process of debt restructuring and an IMF deal. And one of the problems was that because the currency had collapsed, it was near impossible for them to import sufficient fuel. And so there were huge long queues for days on end for people to try and get fuel. And the young minister of energy who was dealing with the problem actually came up with a rather ingenious solution, which was to say, you know what, I don't care whether it's inefficient. It's fair for everyone to have 10 liters. So I'm going to give everybody 10 liters. He got the oil companies to introduce a QR code on every pump, and every pump delivered 10 liters, and that was your weekly ration. And so, and everybody had it on their phone. They go up and they go beep, and they get their 10 liters, and that's it. And that meant that supply equaled demand. Now, it was a very crude way of doing it, but it was widely regarded as a fair way of solving the problem given the, in the midst of crisis. So there are technical ways of targeting fossil fuel subsidies, but unfortunately, fuel literally leaks. It's very easy to get your way around all of the technical ways of targeting fuel subsidies because, you know, you can pass one thing from another tank here to another tank, or you can work your way around the app and so forth. So these technical mechanisms are usually much less effective than actually reforming the subsidies themselves.
Thanks, Neil. I see questions from Ross McLeod and Ian Coxhead. Let me check if they want to ask their questions live. Ross, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Hi, Neil. Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay. Mine's a very simple question. I'm pretty slow on the uptake, but I think one of your early slides showed the distribution of subsidies across various substances, one of which was coal, one of which was probably natural gas, one of which was oil. Would you be able to put that slide up again? My recollection was that coal got a really tiny proportion of the total subsidies, and that kind of surprised me, and you didn't really refer to that. So I'm just wondering whether you might care to comment on that observation.
I think you mean this one, right?
Yes, I believe that's the one.
Yeah. So you're
coal
absolutely
little thing right at the top of each bar, right?
Yeah, so I should have known, Ross, that I wouldn't get a detail past you. So you're absolutely right. Energy subsidies globally, coal has got this tiny little sliver. And the reason why is because these are financial subsidies we're talking here. So we're talking about the difference between the market price and the domestic price mostly, plus whatever tax breaks and whatnot are given to various companies. The truth is that globally, that's not the way in which coal is subsidizing or subsidized. So for the most part, coal is playing in an international marketplace, and therefore it's got market prices domestically because people aren't burning coal in their hearth. They're using it in power stations. So as a result, its actual financial subsidy is small. If I were to show you the IMF figures for energy subsidies, then you would see that coal was massive. And the difference is that the way in which IMF defines subsidies, which is different from the way in which the OECD and the IEA define them, includes the externality. IMF say, how should this fuel be priced in order to take into account its negative impacts upon the rest of the world, including predominantly its air pollution externality, its global warming externality, its congestion externality, and so on and so forth. So they add up all of the externalities. And if I were to show you that bar, then you would see that coal was half of the story. So it really depends on how you define a subsidy. If you define a subsidy financially, coal is getting relatively small financial subsidies globally. I don't know about Australia. There may be big ones in Australia, but globally they're relatively small relative to petroleum and electricity and gas. But in terms of the harm that it does, of course, it's a big part of the story.
I was going to ask you, how come the International Monetary Fund is getting involved in this kind of a study? It seems it's a little bit out of its bailiwick, and I'm not sure that was a good idea. I think the other way of measuring the subsidy is much more meaningful. I think the IMF could generate just about any answer it wanted using that kind of methodology.
That's true. I mean, I always slightly defend the IMF. I do think it's extremely confusing that they've called it subsidy, and it sort of captures the headlines, but then everybody rejects it because it's completely different concept. I do think it's great that they highlight the huge negative externality associated with burning of fossil fuels, including coal.
Thanks, Neil.
Great. Can I invite Ian?
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed your talk very much, Neil. Thank you very much. I apologize in advance. I had to step out for a few minutes during the Q&A, so if I start to talk about something that's already been covered, just please stop me. I guess two things. When we think about the normative part of your talk, the design of, or the strategy, I guess, for solutions to subsidies, I think one thing that really is very important, and I didn't hear it in your presentation, is the timing issue. Obviously, when global prices are low, that's a great time to abolish the subsidy, and that was part of what the Indonesian president's strategy was in 2013-14, of course, was that you have a moment there where you can remove or relax a subsidy without having a really big impact on consumer prices, because the subsidies in nominal terms, and if the global price falls far enough, then the nominal price won't shift very much when you take away the subsidy. But I wanted to, I guess, defend the role of economists when you say that we have very limited scope for making a difference. I think, well, I know where you're going with that, but I want to base this on an experience that I had in Indonesia in 2013, when I had the privilege of talking on this very topic with the then Minister of Finance, Chati Basri. This was about a week before the presidential election. Everyone was thinking about fuel subsidies at the time. And the discussion, of course, came to the question of, well, how do you build coalitions to end or reduce subsidies? And one of the points that I wanted to make with him, and which he, I think, found appealing, was that it's really important to have those parts of the business community who are not directly benefiting from subsidies also understand well what the consequences of the subsidies are for them. And one way to do that is to remind everyone that a subsidy on one commodity or group is a tax on everybody else, because it's got to be financed somehow, right? And in Indonesia, the tax is very visible in the form of underinvestment, for example, in infrastructure and port facilities and other things that have the effect of raising business costs. And I think that one of the important points that needs to be made in the building of coalitions is that, in addition to reimbursing consumers for their direct expenses, there is also a very big role for the business community, for the industrial community, in reminding them that a lower subsidy means the potential for lower business costs and even perhaps lower business taxes.
Ian, it's such a good point. And I didn't intend to entirely dismiss the role of economists, but I was serious about the evidence point. I think one of the challenges which we as researchers have is that we kind of believe a narrative that says that if we just generate enough evidence, then someone will eventually listen. And the reason I put that in is just to sort of prod people to say, what is it that actually makes change happen? Let's study what it is that makes change happen, and it isn't always evident. But I think your point here on a subsidy on one thing as a tax on something else is a great way of putting it. One of the key groups that you need to get on board are the serious non-fossil oriented private sector. They are the key levers, because they also, have political connections, have power, have the ability to influence things, and they are being disadvantaged by these policies. Nigeria has just had an election and will have a new president come the end of May. And it's a very interesting case, because it's finally getting to the stage where the private sector are screaming so loudly, saying these subsidies are just killing the economy. We have to deal with them. Getting that kind of lobby in place in order to push for subsidy reforms is vital, because you're never going to persuade 70% of the population that a subsidy should be taken away and that they should pay higher prices. That's politically always going to be very difficult. But voters and citizens are not the only group in society that politicians have to listen to, and larger business are one and very important group. And final comment, just on this issue of the 70% and why people are opposed to it. There's a wonderful a study from El Salvador about a major LPG subsidy reform which was done there, which shows that people are fickle. What they happened to have was data from before the subsidy reform and from after the subsidy reform, done by a newspaper over a period of time, a survey, which was a representative survey. And they found that in the 2 rounds of the survey that they did before the reform, everybody said that they were opposed to the reform and it was a terrible idea. And they should, in no circumstances should they do this LPG subsidy reform. And then the reform was a great success, and they kept on following them. And by the end of the 6 rounds of the survey that they did, everyone said that they were always in favor of the subsidy and subsidy reform, and that it was a great idea, and they always knew it would work. So, so people change, including their own view of their own opinion.
Well, success has many parents, right?
Indeed.
Failure is an orphan.
Right. Thank you. We've passed our time limit, and I think Neil, you have something else. Neil is coming up, or are you okay for another 5 minutes?
I'm okay for another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay,
No
great. Let me invite Maxensius Sambodo to ask his question. Max, are you there? You're muted.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Pacho. I'm here. Thanks for this opportunity, and thanks for very interesting presentation, Niels. So, in the next few years, 1 year, less than 1 year, Indonesia will have kind of presidential elections. So, if you are one of the the jury, asking question to the candidate of presidents. So, what kind of question are you going to raise to the candidate of president regarding how difficult for Indonesia to pass out the subsidy? That's my question. Thank you, Pacho.
Thank you, Max.
Thanks, Max. This is an impossible one to ask. I mean, that's a tricky one. If Jokowi was in the campaign, then you would ask them, how come you said you were going to abolish it in 2014 and now it's still back at 3% of GDP? But he's not in the campaign. It would be nice to ask Mr. Prabowo, if he's so populist, how is he going to keep 3% of subsidies going forever and ever? But I think you need to tailor the question for the candidate. I think everybody on this call should formulate a question for the president. And let's have a competition and get a good question put in. I'll join in, but you've got better ideas than me.
Okay. Last question. I'll take this one from our friend from Smeru, Tia Yumna. Tia, go ahead.
Thank you, Pacho. Hi, Neil. Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, my question is about still about the politician, because you bring the highlight on them. So do we need specific strategies to make our politician more literate about this looks good but bad policy in terms of subsidy? So, and then do you have any best practice from developed countries or anywhere else that they can have more literate politician and know better about this subsidy? Thank you, Neil.
Yeah. Hi, Atia, and lovely to hear from friends in Smeru again. So I think the problem is, you put it really well. You said this is a policy that looks good, but it's actually bad. What we want is a policy that looks better. That's the key thing. Fossil fuel subsidy reform will never be sexy. Any politician that stands up and says, I'm going to do a fossil fuel subsidy reform is killing their career. But politicians who say, I'm going to give you energy security, politicians that say, I'm going to tackle poverty, politicians that say, I will make sure that there's a clinic that you can actually use and that there'll be a health professional there. Painting a narrative that links reform to something that really is politically attractive, whether it's, getting a good education for your kid, whether it's actually having some decent infrastructure. Interestingly, it's not always the things which we economists would seize upon. We tend to seize upon service delivery. I remember being quite shocked when talking to one of the campaigners in the Nigeria anti-subsidy reform campaign in 2012, who was one of the people who brought everybody out on the streets to campaign against the subsidy reform. And I said to her, okay, well, what sort of compensation would you like? If there was going to be a subsidy reform, what sort of compensation would you like? And she said, oh, I only want one thing. I want the Minister of Petroleum in jail. That really shocked me, but it was actually a very good answer. Her point was people care about corruption, people care about wrongdoing. In Nigeria, they really care about it because there's a lot of corruption, and they wanted to see some redress. And they wanted to see that the government and the president was actually taking this seriously, and everybody knew that the Ministry of Petroleum at the time, Alison Disani, was corrupt. She did get arrested subsequently in London for corruption charges. It's really important that people see that there is justice. So it's not just service delivery, it can be justice, it can be environmental measures, it's whatever actually is salient and resident locally. And it's the Indonesian people who will know what it is that's salient and resident in Indonesia. So that's the narrative that a politician needs to construct in order to sell it.
Thank you, Neil. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up here. There are still some questions. I apologize that we cannot pick them up today, but I'll make sure that we'll send all those questions to Neil. Thank you so much, Neil, for wonderful presentation and discussion. Thanks for everyone to participate. And with that, let me give this back to Lydia.
Thanks again, Neil, and thanks, Acho. Nothing more from me except please join our events next week. I'll put that up before I close the Zoom room. Thank you again. See you. And for everyone that is fasting, selamat berpuasa. Semoga lancar. Thanks again, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Acho.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.